God's Word. Now, I think we've got an entire story told in a few verses from 2 chapters of Genesis. I think we're going to have to rehearse this story. So think back to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was promised children as numerous as the stars in the sky, and he had one. Remember that? One child, Isaac? And still, they were promised as many as stars in the sky. Isaac had how many children? 2 twins. And Esau was born seconds before Jacob, also later on known as Israel, but as Jacob. But Jacob was sneaky, and his mother was sneaky, and managed to steal the blessing of the firstborn from his brother Esau, at which point Esau was very angry. Jacob had to flee for his life, finally came back, and they were reconciled. But Jacob was the one through whom the line continued. Now, Jacob had a bunch of kids. He had apparently 12 boys and 1 girl, the girl rarely being mentioned, by 4 different, 2 wives and 2 slaves of wives. They did things, family values were different back then. And, but his favorite wife was Rachel. And Rachel was not very fertile, but Leah, his unfavoritist wife, was. And at the time that this story starts, Rachel had only had 1 child, and that child was Joseph. And Joseph was the son of Jacob's old age, so apparently the baby of the family. And sometimes the babies of the family are a little spoiled. He was definitely Dad's favorite child. So here we're going to hear a bit of that story, and we'll see if there's anything else that needs to, well, there's a little bit more that'll need to be filled in between the 2 readings. They leave a lot out here, but you know, 13 or 14 verses, we're probably going to not read all of those on a Sunday morning. So we're going to start out at the beginning of chapter 37. 3rd verse. Now, Israel, the other name for Jacob, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children. Now, we all know that Mom loved the other one best, but in this case, apparently Dad did love this one best, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. I think everybody else basically had gunny sacks with holes cut in them, no sleeves. Now, some of the translations said it was many colors, so that's where you get the idea of Joseph and his many-colored coat. So he had a long robe with sleeves, better than any of the other kids had. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now, that's not different from too many families where the kids sort of fight all the time. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field." Here Linda has made us a lovely sheaf bound. "Suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, sort of like, "Who died and made you chief?" His brothers said, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. You may remember there was another dream that they're not putting in this reading about the sun and the 12 stars and the moon circling around Joseph as the center of the universe. We all know that we, on the other hand, are the center of the universe. And again, they hated him more for his dreams. Also, Joseph was a tattletale. Dad would not send Joseph out with the brothers who had to move the flocks from field to field, if you can call them fields, where the sheep and the goats could manage to eat the little bits of greenery they could find. And they definitely had to move from day to day. And they had to be taken to water a certain number of times. And so that was the kids' job. And I don't think Joseph was too young exactly, because his father would send him out to spy on the brothers and make sure they were doing everything right. And then he would run back and tattle to Dad. So this is one of those times the brothers had gone out, you know, maybe for a week or so at a time. I don't know. And so Dad says, well, Joe, go out, go check on your brother and see if they're doing all right. So Joseph couldn't find them where they'd gone first, so he asked somebody who lived there, and the man said, well, they've gone away, for I heard them say, let's go over to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits, one of those dry wells. Then we'll say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we'll see what will become of his dreams. But when the brother Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. Reuben said, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, so that he could rescue his brother out of their hand and restore him to their father. But then Judah, another brother, said to his brothers, well, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. So the brothers agreed. They threw him in a pit, and then they went off to handle the sheep and the goats. So they didn't see what happened next. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, the boy's gone. Where can I turn? Then they took Joseph's robe, which apparently had been left behind. They slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, this we've found. See now whether it's your son's robe or not. Jacob recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned his son for many days. Now we're going to move to Genesis 50, but in between, you may remember what happened. Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar as a slave, and Potiphar's wife tried to seduce this young man, and he refused, and so she said, oh, he tried to rape me, and had him thrown into prison where he was going to be executed. But he wasn't, because, do you remember the story? The Pharaoh, I guess, had dreams, and no one could tell him what they meant. He had dreams of 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. That's right. And Joseph said, I know what it means. 7 years of plenty and 7 years, that's right, of drought and famine. So he said, you better store up grain during these fat years. And they did, and it saved, who knows, hundreds, thousands of people from dying. Now, in that time, his family, of course, whom he hadn't seen in many, many years, was also having trouble with the drought. And some of the brothers, at least all but the littlest one who had been born, Joseph had never seen him, another child of Rachel. She died in childbirth having this son, Benjamin. The father would never let Benjamin go anywhere. He was so afraid that something would happen to him because something had happened to his other favorite son. So the brothers came, and they came to an official of the Egyptian government and said, could we bring our flocks here for a while until rain comes back to our own land? And the official said, well, let me think about it. Do you have any more brothers? And they said, what? What's that got to do with anything? Do you have any more brothers? Well, yes, we have a little brother. You bring him here. You bring him here, and then I'll think about it. Now, what is this guy doing? So they convinced their father, convinced old Jacob, to let Benjamin go with them. They came back. And apparently at that point, Joseph revealed who he was. This official they had gone to see was indeed Joseph, who had been elevated to this high place in the government. And he said, it's wonderful, you can go home, get your dad, come back, and I'm going to send you with all sorts of treasures. And they went on their way, but he had hidden a chalice in Benjamin's saddlebags. And so then he made this big, I won't say Joseph took no revenge on these brothers, but he didn't kill them. He said, where's my chalice? Where's my chalice? And they found it in Benjamin's saddlebags. And he said, well, then I guess this one's, you all have to come back and go to jail. And at that point, I think what happened was they had to leave Benjamin. They went back. During that time, the old man had died, and they were trying to figure out, what can we do? What can we do? Finally, when they came back another time, really afraid of what their brother was going to do to them, this is the point where Joseph said, I forgive you. I guess we're back at that part now. So, realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him? So they approached Joseph saying, your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept. The brothers also wept and fell down before him and said, we're here as your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as God is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. In this way, Joseph reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So we see Joseph forgiving his brothers. And there is a verse from the Gospel of Luke. We're not actually going back to the Lord's Prayer where it says, forgive, God will forgive your sins and you will forgive the sins of others. Here's Jesus saying this is how you're supposed to treat people. Love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. This is the word of the Lord. We human beings are meaning makers. We look for patterns. We try to find cause and effect in the relationship of one event to another. We don't like chaos, and so we impose our own sense of order on the world. Sometimes that might mean someone being in denial. They hear some shocking news and they say, no, that can't have happened. No, it's not true. The first thing that we often do in the face of horrible news is say, no, it can't be true. I saw them yesterday. I talked to them on the phone just this morning, something like that. It's our way of trying to impose order on a world that seems to suddenly have turned to chaos. It might be an entire nation pushing a narrative of blame of those who are different, when our own livelihoods and relationships are crumbling. Sure, it's those gay people's fault because our straight marriages are falling apart. How does that work? Or a young man I worked with when I was working with people in poverty, coming in for help, maybe with food or gasoline, and he clearly was someone who was not ever going to be able to hold a job. He just wasn't. But instead of saying, what can I do for myself, he said, it's those refugees. They're taking all our jobs. It's easier to impose our own idea, our own cause and effect, our own reasonableness on a situation because we try to make meaning. I have heard people say in the most difficult of times, everything happens for a reason. But I think, no, it doesn't. You'd like it to, but it doesn't always happen for a reason. While the phrase might bring some comfort to the person saying it, because they're imposing some kind of order, even if it's wishful thinking, onto a very difficult situation, I would caution you never ever to say it to someone who has just had a major loss, because they might just be silent. They might well come back at you. That's not comforting. What reason would God have or anyone have that would convince me that there was any kind of reason my child had to die, or that I would get cancer, or that my house would burn? For a lot of people, saying that there's a reason for everything is not a comfort. Maybe in time, it will seem to make sense. And we have a story today, the story of Joseph being sold into slavery, abandoned by his family. And we have a story that seems to, in the end, say, well, there was a reason for this. The story of Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat, it would be nowhere near as fun to say Joseph and his long-sleeved shirt, would it? But it's long been a favorite of ours, and especially of children, up till the point where Joseph is carted off to Egypt, and I don't know that we tell them about the rest of the story. Maybe we do. But he's sold into slavery, and his disgusted brothers, now appalled at themselves, had no idea what happened to him. Again, much happens in those intervening chapters that we didn't read. Joseph's thrown into prison because he refused his mistress's advances. So she accused him of attacking her, and he escaped execution because of his ability to interpret dreams. And because he was able to save so many people from starvation, he was raised to the level of, I don't know, Fed chairman, something like that, the exchequer. He knew how to take care of business. A multicolored rags to riches story. And that'd be pretty good, but that still wasn't the end of the story. Again, his acumen in handling food distribution during a drought had not extended to his family of origin, which was, they lived in a different country. But when they went looking for better pasture and went to ask this official if their tribe could spend a little time in Egypt until their own land had grass again, well, Joseph recognized them immediately, but all they saw was an Egyptian official. And Joseph played some cruel practical jokes on them, but he did manage to get all his brothers back in Egypt. But finally, when he revealed who he was, he wept. And although it may not be this particular story, he'd sent all the Egyptians out of the room and closed the doors. He wept so loudly with joy, really, that everybody in the palace heard and wondered what was going on. Because Joseph's life had so dramatically turned around, Joseph made sense out of his brother's cruelty by deciding that there had been a reason for it. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good. God did redeem the brothers abandoning Joseph in a pit and their covering up his disappearance by convincing their father that a wild animal ate him. God turned around the story of a spoiled brat, the eldest son of Jacob and his favorite wife, from a tattletale and dad's pet to a national official who could save lives. God meant everything for good. That's how Joseph made sense of it. He could say, looking back, everything happens for a reason. The stories of our ancestors in the faith are full of God redeeming people from messes of their own making or family messes. There's so many stories of brothers taking revenge on each other, starting with the creation story. Then we get to Abraham, and he sent his eldest son, Ishmael, by his wife's slave. He sent the mother and the child into the desert to die because Sarah, his wife, was jealous. But they lived. God took care of them, and Ishmael created his own tribe. The story is that that's where Islam came from, but this story greatly predated the birth of Islam. Then there was Isaac, Isaac's younger son, Jacob, born seconds after his older twin Esau, and how he stole the blessing of the firstborn. Then he had to flee for his life because Esau would have hunted him down. But finally they reconciled to a degree, and Jacob went on to father many sons and one daughter by 4 women. Joseph wasn't the oldest in this case. He was just the favorite, and God turned that family tragedy into joy. Those sagas of the patriarchs have happy endings. And then we hear of Moses, who was a murderer and had to flee for his life. But eventually God called him to be the leader of a tribe that would become free and that would travel to the promised land. God turns it around, not without hardship and trial and wilderness wanderings, but God makes some sense out of the brokenness in the lives of our heroes of the faith. When we look at Jesus, remember that he was teaching and his own family came and said, "Get him out of there. He must have gone crazy." They didn't like what he was doing. They knew he was putting his own life at risk. They said, "Let's go take him out of there." And Jesus said, "Who's my family? My family are the people who listen to me." I think they did reconcile, some of them, after that, but nonetheless, even our Jesus had a family that was in a bit of a mess for a while there. He defended his own tribe, the religious leaders. He defended the Romans, the occupiers, because he was so popular they were afraid of him. He went through suffering and even death. That story almost doesn't have a happy ending, but God turned that around too with Easter morning. And don't you know, Christians are still wrestling with, how do we make sense out of this? Did he really have to die? Was God angry? The questions are still there. Why did Jesus have to die? And some of us make sense out of it, and some of us still ask, why? Maybe later we'll understand it. Maybe after we die, as one of my friends says, God has a lot to answer for, and I plan on asking. Maybe we'll find that God rewards us for our undeserved suffering. When nothing else on this earth, even 20/20 hindsight, gives us meaning, allows us to make meaning out of something, when the Redeemer has not yet turned it around, at least we can plan on an afterlife. We Christians, bliss after death, where there's no pain, no suffering. Everything is love and light, and presumably we don't fight with our brothers and sisters anymore. Can you blame us for needing an afterlife? For saying, in our way of imposing our reasons on the world, on our lives, God is going to turn this around someday. Think about the spirituals sung by people in slavery, or the old gospel songs sung by people in Appalachia. So many of them focus on what it's going to be like after we die. That there's suffering here, but life will be wonderful. This new life after we die. It's a way that we make sense of the world. Pie in the sky by and by. We need to do that sometimes. I've needed to do that. But I think we can hope for something in this life. That we will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. You probably know the old song, farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brothers, live in the sunshine. We'll understand it all by and by. For a lot of people, frankly, a good afterlife just doesn't answer their question of why does this happen. Think about Job. Covered in sores, suffering, even having lost his children, although he'd always been a righteous person. And other people wanted to say, well, we'll make sense out of it. You must have sinned somewhere. Even God didn't think that. No, God and the tempter had made a bet. That's why it happened. Job insisted that God explain why this had happened. And amazingly enough, God did speak to Job. Not often does this happen, but what was God's answer? Was God's answer, oh, well, Heavenly Council and I were just having a bit of fun? No. God said, oh, do you think you can understand me and everything I've done? Who do you think you are? It's a pretty tough answer. I don't think it answered Job's question. Not a satisfying answer. So people throughout our history have challenged God and said, why? The prophet Jeremiah, called by God to speak God's truth to a country that was running headlong into disaster. What did Jeremiah receive for his troubles? More trouble. People hated him. They threw him in a well at one point. Jeremiah says to God, why is my pain unceasing, my wound incurable, refusing to be healed? Truly, God, you're like a deceitful brook, like waters that fail. And a little bit later, Lord, you have enticed me, and I was enticed. You've overpowered me, and you have prevailed. And I have become a laughingstock all day long. Everyone mocks me. We're in good company then if we ask God, why? 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 Jeremiah says, why did you even call me, God? Why have you let bad things happen? Does everything happen for a reason? Really? I think human beings do all that we can to find a reason. And with 20/20 hindsight, we often find that despite our loss, our grief, our anger, our hopelessness, we have in the long run been brought back into the land of the living. You probably know personally people who have turned their mourning into passionate advocacy for those who suffer in similar ways. Think of how many people participate, say, in the Relay for Life or Alzheimer's walks. Those who started foundations for research, or those who help with groups for parents who've lost children. In our grieving and our angry protests to God, who has caused or allowed chaos, we think so. We blame God for it often. You've allowed chaos to break out in our lives. Nothing makes sense. Everything we thought we knew or believed has sunk to the bottom of the sea. When we experience our old ways dying, then we have a vulnerability that allows us to see something we may never have been able to see before. Our God is a vulnerable God. When we give up looking for a reason for everything, God can give us the unreasonable gift of resurrection, this side of the grave, not something we can take any credit for, not something that we can put on a timeline that says this caused this, caused this. Much of our faith is unreasonable. Doesn't mean that it's untrue. God's ways are mysterious. They can't be mapped or predicted. We can't put God in a box. God's ways look like chaos at times. And it is only out of chaos that something new can come. If everything is in order and everything makes sense, there is no reason to change. And it takes time before we can see the good that may have emerged from a situation that has been without reason. When God redeems the suffering doesn't go away. What has happened has happened. At least the event doesn't go away, and our memory of it doesn't go away. We may never be able to make sense out of what happened. But God can turn us around in such a way that our life returns, our joy returns little bit by little bit. We start making a meaning of sorts out of our own story. We weave into our story what has happened to us, what God has done for us. We rediscover a narrative that we thought had been lost. And somehow we acknowledge God's mysterious ways of turning us and our lives, and we can pray even the world around. Amen.